Welcome to this explainer. Okay, I am absolutely thrilled to dive into this one with you today because we are unpacking the wild story of the 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. We're going to cut right to the chase here because this guy's entry into the White House was, well, it was nothing short of explosive.
So let's kick things off with a massive question. What exactly happens when a presidential candidate literally loses the popular vote, but somehow still manages to snag the White House by a single electoral vote? It sounds like a total hypothetical, right? Like something out of a modern political thriller. But actually, this is 100% real American history.
Part 1. The contested 1876 election. To really wrap our heads around how this happened, we have to look at this incredibly fraught showdown where Hayes faced off against New York Democrat Samuel Tilden.
Now, just take a second to think about this staggering number, 250,000. Even with massive cultural icons like Mark Twain out there campaigning for him, Hayes honestly didn't think he stood a chance. And, well, he definitely didn't win the popular vote. He lost to Tilden by a margin of 250,000 votes. And to make matters even more chaotic, the Electoral College votes in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina became fiercely contested. So what do you do when a national election is just completely fractured? I mean, for months, there was total agonizing uncertainty across the country. The solution didn't actually come until January 1877, when Congress scrambled to establish an impromptu 15-member electoral commission just to settle the dispute. And with a breakdown of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats on that panel, you can probably guess how this played out. Yep, the commission voted perfectly down party lines, 8-7, strictly in favor of Hayes.
And that brings us to the crucial point here, this razor-thin margin. That commission's decision officially handed the final electoral tally to Hayes by a count of 185 to 184. Literally, a single electoral vote changed the entire course of American history.
You know, this brilliantly illustrates just how incredibly tense the country was at the time. The atmosphere was completely toxic. To avoid public backlash or even the threat of potential uprisings, Hayes became the very first president to take his oath of office straight inside the White House. He was secretly sworn in right there in the Red Room on Saturday, March 3rd, 1877.
Which brings us to Part 2, a Civil War hero. Before we really get into his time in office, we need to ask, who exactly was the man at the center of this political storm? Tracing his path before politics, it reveals just an incredible resume. Hayes wasn't just some run-of-the-mill politician. He was highly accomplished. Get this, he graduated as his class valedictorian from Kenyon College in 1842, earned a Harvard Law degree by 1845, and then went on to serve with absolute distinction in the Civil War. I mean, he rose all the way to the rank of Major General and was wounded 5 different times, with the most serious being at the Battle of South Mountain in 1862. By 1867, he had pivoted to become the governor of Ohio, eventually setting a record as the first person ever to earn a 3rd term in that office. So long before the White House, this was a man entirely defined by his resilience and service.
Part 3, Compromise and National Crises. And boy, would that resilience be immediately tested. His time in the Oval Office was heavily defined by severe compromise right out of the gate. The Compromise of 1877 was essentially the backroom deal that allowed Hayes to take office peacefully. It was a very clear trade-off. The Republicans received the presidency. In exchange, Southern Democrats were assured at least one cabinet post, specifically the Postmaster General, and, most crucially, the withdrawal of federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina. The real-world impact of this compromise was just monumental. Withdrawing those federal troops effectively ended the Reconstruction era. It returned the South to home rule, which ultimately marked a massive setback for the equal rights progress that had been inching forward since the Civil War. Now, Hayes actually spent a great deal of time during his presidency pushing for civil rights laws to protect Black Americans, especially when it came to the voting booth. But because the House of Representatives was controlled by Democrats at the time, virtually every single one of his moves on this front was completely blocked. Finding himself stonewalled on civil rights, Hayes realized he had to pivot. So he focused his attention on revamping the civil service process. At the time, government jobs were basically just handed out based on political loyalty. Hayes fought tooth and nail to change that into a system based on actual merit. And while he didn't really get to see the full fruits of his labor during his own term, he absolutely laid the vital groundwork that the 21st president, Chester A. Arthur, would later implement through the Pendleton Act, which finally mandated civil service exams.
On top of all the political gridlock, he also had to manage massive economic unrest. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 saw railroad workers all across the country walking off the job to protest steep pay cuts. The ensuing riots got so intense that it prompted Hayes to actually deploy federal troops to calm the situation. Ultimately, that conflict ended in a victory for the railroads, as the workers were forced to return to their posts with those pay cuts still firmly intact. Let's shift gears a bit to part 4, White House firsts. Because amidst all this heavy, intense national drama, the Hayes family actually brought a pretty surprising wave of modernization to the executive mansion. Technology and culture were shifting immensely during his one term in office. I mean, the White House saw its very first typewriter and its first telephone. We already talked about how he was the first to take the oath of office inside the White House, but here's a really fascinating one. His wife, Lucy Webb, was a graduate of Cincinnati's Wesleyan Women's College. That made her the very first Lady in American history to hold a college degree. How cool is that? And First Lady Lucy Hayes really made her mark immediately. She instituted a strict, completely alcohol-free policy, banning all wines and liquors from the White House. This brought absolute joy to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a group whose ultimate goal was a sober and pure world. Politically speaking, this was actually quite savvy, because the first couple's ban successfully helped convince a lot of prohibitionists to vote Republican. Finally, Part 5, Spiegel Grove and Legacy. So what exactly happens after you survive one of the most stressful elections and presidencies in American history? Well, from the very beginning of his campaign, Hayes had pledged to serve only a single term as president, and he kept his word. In 1881, he stepped down and retired to Spiegel Grove in Fremont, Ohio. This was a gorgeous estate that he had actually inherited back in 1873 after the passing of his uncle Sardis, who originally built the home. Now, if you're wondering where that unique name comes from, Spiegel is actually the German and Dutch word for mirror. His uncle named it that for the beautiful, glass-like reflective pools of water that would collect all over the property after a good rain. It really paints a picture of this incredibly peaceful retreat after such a stormy political career. But if you think Hayes just sat back in a rocking chair and relaxed, think again. He dedicated the rest of his life to vigorous advocacy. He focused on progressive causes like children's literacy, prison reform, and actively trying to find ways to close the widening gap between rich and poor Americans. He remained deeply, passionately committed to public service right up until he passed away in 1893. Now, this next part is a monumental piece of trivia that every history buff really should know. Following his death, the Hayes Commemorative Library and Museum opened at Spiegel Grove in 1916. Why does that matter? Because this became the very first presidential library in the United States. It was such a big deal that decades later, in 1928, Congress even authorized the donation of original iron gates straight from the White House to be placed at the gateways of his Ohio home. I want to leave you with this touching little detail from the Spiegel Grove estate before we wrap up. Also buried on those grounds is Old Whitey. Old Whitey was a beloved war horse that belonged to Hayes during the Civil War, and the horse actually served as the mascot for the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. When the horse died in 1879, he was buried there with a marker bearing this exact quote: "Old Whitey, a hero of 19 battles, 1861 to 1865. It's just this profound, quiet reminder of Hayes's deep, lifelong roots as a soldier and a leader. Which brings us to the big question you should be taking away from this explainer today. From a literal one-vote electoral victory and secret White House oaths to pushing for civil service reform and establishing the very first presidential library, how does the legacy of this often overlooked president reshape our understanding of American history? Rutherford B. Hayes proves that for sure, sometimes the most dramatic, pivotal moments in our history belong to the names we hear the absolute least. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.